Hello and welcome to tonight's conversation about End Housing for All, The Fight to End Homelessness in America by Maria Foscarinis. We are delighted to have you all joining us tonight at the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library. My name is Jackie Trailis, and I am a member of the programs team here at SNFL. Before we start, I would like to thank the Stavros Niarchos Foundation for making programs like this evening's possible. I would also like to remind you that if you do not already have a library card, it is easy to get one by visiting any information desk in this building. Finally, I would like to encourage you to visit NYPL's website and take a look at upcoming 7 Stories Up programs like this one. We have an excellent lineup this season featuring new fiction, nonfiction, music, local history, and more. We would love to have you in this space with us again. And now let me introduce our speakers. Maria Foscarinis founded the National Homelessness Law Center, formerly known as the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty, in 1985 to mount a campaign for a federal response to the crisis which was just beginning to explode across the country. The Law Center won legal victories, including the only major federal legislation addressing homelessness, now known as the McKinney-Vento Homelessness Assistance Act, upholding education rights for homeless children, converting vacant properties to housing, and combating the criminalization of homelessness, while also laying the groundwork for the recognition of housing as a human right. She has been named a Human Rights Hero by the American Bar Association and is a recipient of the Catherine and George Alexander Law Prize from Santa Clara University School of Law, the John Macy Award from the National Alliance to End Homelessness, the Public Interest Law Award from the Public Interest Foundation at Columbia Law School, and a Rockefeller Foundation practitioner residency in Bellagio, Italy. Binyamin Appelbaum is an opinion writer for the New York Times, focusing on business and economics, and a member of the paper's editorial board. He writes often about the nation's housing crisis. He worked for a decade as a Washington correspondent for the paper before joining the editorial board in 2019. His first book, The Economist's Hour, False Prophets, Free Markets, and the Fracture of Society, tells the story of how economic thinking, including faith in markets, came to dominate public policymaking. He lives in Washington, D.C. Without further ado, please welcome Maria and Binya.
Good evening. It's a long walk up to the stage. Yeah. This book, I don't know how many of you have had a chance to read it yet, but I think it's a really important book. Both because it tells a story that I think not enough Americans know about how we came to have this homelessness crisis, and because it is deeply informed by your life work. It is full of the stories of people that you have worked with and tried to help, of your understanding of their predicament, and most importantly, I think, your analysis of how we can do better as a country to address homelessness. So I think it's an honor to be here with you and to talk to you about this book.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
And stories should begin at the beginning. So I want you to start by telling us how this became your life's work. How did you get interested in the issue of homelessness? How did you come to be involved in this?
Well, the short answer is I volunteered for a pro bono case while I was working at Sullivan & Cromwell, a big law firm here in the city. And I took on a case representing homeless families who had been denied emergency shelter. They lived out on Long Island in a wealthy suburb of the city, but they were lacking the basics. They were lacking shelter. They had lost their homes. They were unable to afford new housing. And I worked on this case for a couple of years while I was at the firm, and it was really eye-opening to me. I mean, I always knew, of course, theoretically, there's extreme poverty in our country, in our city, but actually going there, meeting the families, talking to them, seeing the conditions they were living in, it was just, and also knowing that I, as a lawyer, could do something about it was enormously exciting, and just, you know, it was simultaneously enraging to see these conditions in an otherwise wealthy part of the country, but also exciting to know that there was something I could do about this. So that's sort of the short answer, although it's longer than I intended, but it's the short answer of how I got involved. You know, there's more of a backstory, which is that I grew up in a family. I'm a child of immigrants. I grew up with a strong sense of social justice, My parents talked almost every night at the dinner table about all the suffering they had endured when Greece was occupied by the Nazis, and how many people died and starved, literally starved to death, even though there was food available in the countryside. Couldn't get to the city, couldn't get to Athens, and literally hundreds of thousands of people died. So this contrast, the abundance coupled with the deprivation, just was shocking to me and enraging. So it was something, that sense of injustice, I think, somehow was embedded in me, and this pro bono case gave me a way to do something about it in a very specific way, and homelessness embodies that to me.
I'm sorry. And this family that you were encountering in Nassau County, this was something a little new in the world. It's interesting, after World War II, you can find any number of predictions that America was going to eradicate homelessness, that the rise of prosperity would end this problem in this country, and yet by the late 70s and early 80s, we were finding that our country, while more prosperous than ever, was also experiencing more homelessness than ever, and not just in the cities, but in places like Nassau County. What went wrong? How did we end up in that situation?
Right. Well, it was shocking at the time to see homelessness in Nassau County and in the suburbs. And homelessness actually exploded in the United States in the early 1980s. It became a national crisis that is still with us today. And what happened then was, so President Reagan came into office in 1981, vowing to shrink the federal government. He was going to make America great. And he really slashed social safety net programs, and housing programs for poor people took an enormous hit. So they were cut by over 50%. And the country went from funding hundreds of thousands of units of housing affordable to poor people in the late 70s to funding just a handful, 3,000 in 1982. So this is an enormous shift. So that's the immediate trigger. The groundwork had already been laid in the 70s with the destruction of inexpensive housing, mainly in the form of SROs, single room occupancy housing, which had been a source of cheap housing in many cities, including New York. So that had already happened. Those units had been lost to private developers who saw an opportunity to build more lucrative housing. So that redevelopment had already started, but then the cuts in the early 80s sort of triggered this enormous explosion of homelessness.
Mm-hmm. And your early work then in the 1980s is in a response to this emerging crisis. And you initially tried to sell the government on comprehensive reform. That proves a tough sell. Talk a little bit about what is achieved at that time.
Well, so yes, so after I worked on this case, and then I left the firm and moved to Washington. The mission at the time was to get the federal government to respond to what was clearly a national crisis. And I was working at the time with a coalition, the National Coalition for the Homeless, and we wanted to, I worked with a group of other advocates to create something called the Homeless Person Survival Act, which is a comprehensive proposal, what we thought was needed to address homelessness. It had three parts. So part one was emergency relief, part two was preventive measures, and part three was long-term solutions. And what ended up happening was part one became, it was enormously challenging to even get this thing introduced in Congress. It was considered, Reagan's idea at the time was that homelessness isn't an issue for federal policy. It's a lifestyle choice. People are out on the street because they want to be. They like the freedom of living on the streets. And that was his idea. And Congress, of course, was dominated by Reagan at the time, and most people had that same mindset. And getting support for federal legislation to address this crisis was enormously difficult. So eventually we're able to get this three-part proposal introduced in Congress. So at least it could be considered. But then trying to get it enacted, after an enormous campaign of what I call strange bedfellows, and I was one of those strange bedfellows. But after this enormous campaign, we were able to get only part one enacted. So that was the emergency part. That was funding primarily for emergency shelters. And everyone knows, and we knew at the time, shelter is not the solution to homelessness, housing is. But this was what we could do. This was what was possible politically then. And it was hard to get. So it was a huge victory at the time. And this is what became the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. It was a big victory, but it was not nearly enough, and certainly not what we intended. And the promise from Congress was that this was the first step. It would be followed by further steps. Of course, the next steps never came.
Right, and I'm pausing on that moment because in a lot of ways it feels to me, and you can push back if you disagree, but it feels to me like we've kind of been frozen in that dynamic ever since the mid-'80s, which is to say that to the extent that we as a society address homelessness at all, we do it in terms of trying to accommodate the people who are homeless, providing shelters for them, ensuring their children can go to school. We treat homelessness as a fact of life and then try to mitigate the negative consequences. But we've never, as a society, been willing to take the next step of saying, how can we actually end homelessness? How can we actually help people escape this condition? And indeed, it strikes me that we've gotten pretty good and pretty comfortable with the mitigation. And I guess the question I have for you is, do you think that when you look back on it, that the success of this effort to mitigate some of the effects has taken away some of the energy that might have been invested in solving the problem? And if I can just put a point on it, here in New York in that era, there was an important court case that established a right to shelter,
Right.
but not permanent shelter, temporary shelter.
Right.
And so New York, swept its homelessness problem for the most part out of sight. There was never the sort of Skid Row type, campground in downtown New York. Did that make it harder to sell New York politicians on actually helping the people who were, safely out of sight in these shelters?
So that's a very good question, and that's a question I've struggled with for a long time. But ultimately, I think I don't blame the shelter solution or the partial solution. It's not the fault of that. Those solutions help people. I mean, the McKinney-Vento Act has helped people. The right to shelter in this city helps people. It's not their fault. They're doing the best they can. The fault is with the failure to do more. And yes, you can say that because of these solutions, maybe there's less pressure to do more, but there's no guarantee that without them, there would be more. So I don't think that that's the problem. The problem is that, we know what the solutions are, and we, or I should say, political leaders are not actually implementing them. They need pressure. They need to be pressured. One thing that has changed is that as a result of, for example, the federal level I can speak to, as a result of the McKinney-Vento Act, there's now federal funding going to these groups that are offering shelter. They used to be the activists pushing government. Now, the recipients of federal fund, they're a lot more constrained in their activism. So that makes it harder. But that's not to say that that's the problem. The problem is that we need to put a lot more pressure on officials in government to do what everybody knows is the solution, which is housing.
There has always been this narrative about homelessness that it is the product of personal choice, or if not personal choice, personal failure.
Right.
That people are essentially responsible for being homeless. Talk about that in terms of your own experience working with people who have experienced homelessness.
Well, I think that's a false narrative. That's a narrative that was started by Reagan, calling homelessness a lifestyle choice. He said people choose to be homeless. That's a narrative that's been repeated. It was repeated by President Clinton, who talked about who ran in a campaign of ending welfare as we know it, and this narrative of poverty, homelessness, being personal failures is sort of threaded throughout the past decades. So that is a very harmful narrative. In my experience and in my work, I haven't met people who are homeless because they've decided they would like to be homeless. They are homeless because they lost their housing. Something happened. Every person reaches homelessness through their own particular way. And you can always look at someone's individual story and say, well, they should have done this, or they should have done that, or why didn't they? But if you step back, this is an enormous crisis. This is not a crisis of individual decisions. This is a crisis of institutional failures, systemic failures. You don't have so many people homeless because somehow they suddenly decided, people woke up and decided to become homeless. No, and certainly in my experience, that is not how this plays out. Something happens, people lose a job, people can't afford their rent, they get evicted, they become homeless. And the structural failures are very clear to see. We can see the cuts in funding for housing for poor people. Right now, there are federal programs still, at least as of this moment, that are in theory providing funding to support housing for people who can't afford it. Right now, only 1 in 4 of people who are poor enough to qualify actually gets this help. So that's a clear structural cause. There are many causes like that that have led us to this moment. And we haven't always had this crisis in this country, but we do now. And it's not individuals. These are, over the years I've met so many people, so many families, people are working so hard to try to keep a roof over their heads and try to take care of their children. And it's just so deeply unfair to blame them when there are all these structural factors that are driving this. And I think people are starting more and more to understand this because there's a crisis of affordable housing in our country, and I think a lot of people are feeling that right now.
Yes, absolutely. To me, one of the most striking illustrations of what you were just saying is that homelessness, of course, occurs everywhere in the country. It's roughly 3 times more common here in New York City than in Detroit, not because New Yorkers are more subject to mental illness or more likely to engage in substance abuse. It's just because housing is less affordable and harder to come by in New York. And we see that across the country. The harder it is to find housing, the more likely people are to end up without housing. And that brings us to the title of your book, End Housing for All.
Yes.
You've already said it, but I want you to elaborate on it. The idea that the solution to homelessness is housing for all. Housing is a human right. On the one hand, sounds like so simple, but it's profound as well. Talk a little bit about why that's the answer.
Well, so there's a lot of evidence that housing is the solution to homelessness. It seems sort of obvious, kind of self-evident, but there's also studies that back this up. There's something called Housing First, which is a programmatic model, which says to end somebody's homelessness, first get that person into housing, and then some people need additional help. Some people may need help with mental health issues or with substance abuse issues. Provide that help once people are in housing. So you need the stability of home for any of these other interventions to work. That's the simple premise. And that's a very successful programmatic model. There are a lot of studies backing this up, a lot of evidence showing it works. It gets people housed, they stay housed, and that's an excellent solution. The problem with this is that for this to really address the crisis that we have at the scale that we have, it needs to be implemented on a much broader level. So for this to work, you need housing. Housing first doesn't work in the absence of housing, and you need affordable housing, and that's grossly lacking. There's no funding for this. So you can make this housing first is the official policy, or was the official policy of the federal government, but you can't just make it the official policy and not back it up with funding. So, countries that have been successful, so Finland is one example, in almost ending homelessness, have invested public funds in housing, much more so than the United States. And they call it social housing. But it's a big investment of government funding in ensuring that everybody has affordable housing. And that's treating housing as a human right. It is a human right. The human right to housing doesn't mean everybody gets a free home. It means that the government has policies in place that ensure that there's enough housing for everybody. It's not just left to the whims of the market, which is where we are right now. Right now, housing is dominated by money. It's treated as a vehicle for profit. So it's an investment vehicle. It's seen as a commodity, not as a human right, as a social good. So that's, I think, our real challenge now. And it's something that has gotten worse over the past few decades.
In New York, publicly owned housing forms a larger share of the housing stock than in any other U.S. metropolitan area by some distance. This is really the only place in the country where we have public housing at real scale. And even here, it doesn't have the greatest reputation.
No.
The people who live in it often don't want to live there. This is not Finland or Vienna where people line up to get into these projects. Here they are more often trying to figure out how to get out if they can. Why, if you're trying to convince people that this is the way forward, that we should have more of this,
Right.
How do you do that given its history?
Right. Well, so the reason that public housing has acquired a bad reputation is because first of all, it's been massively defunded. Funding for public housing has been systematically decreased. So housing has been left in disrepair without security. It's falling apart. So it's, of course, easy to criticize, and it's in fact been demonized. So it has a poor reputation. It doesn't have to be. So in Finland, this, what they call social housing, is embraced. It's seen as a good thing, not as a bad thing. This is sort of part of the same narrative that we were talking about, the narrative that it's bad, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. If you're getting any kind of government help, it's your fault. This is a very destructive narrative. It's also a very false narrative because everybody gets public help. It's just not talked about it that way. The tax code gives much more money to homeowners in the form of mortgage deductions than it does to people who are poor and need affordable housing. And yet that's not called welfare. Homeowners are not demonized as being people who are benefiting from handouts. So this is, this is part of the same idea. Once you demonize something and you defund it, then you can turn around and say, look, we told you it's not working. This is a bad thing. So sure, if you're in housing that's falling apart and not kept up, you might want to leave.
You spoke a moment ago about your reasons for hope, and I do want to come back to that. But we've also seen in recent years an increasing tendency toward the criminalization of homelessness, toward an intolerance for the presence of people experiencing homelessness in our communities. Talk about what is happening and in your view, why that is happening.
Right. So this is a major trend. Homelessness is being criminalized, and that's been the case. It was really a trend that started in the 1990s, and actually former Mayor Giuliani was a big proponent and a big reason behind this trend. And it's basically, these are laws that make it a crime for people to live in public places, to sleep, to sit, to eat, basically criminalizing the public presence of people without housing. And it is a growing trend. It is, I would say, the dominant response now in cities and states around the country. And why? I think this is part of that failure to solve the crisis. I mean, and the perception perhaps that solutions have been tried, nothing works, people are on the street, there's pressure on local politicians to do something, and the easy thing to do is pass a law outlawing the public presence of people. So I think it's a kind of a knee-jerk reaction that that is just a very short-term response to appear to be doing something that does nothing.
And I think it bears emphasis. We've had Ronald Reagan already figure in this narrative as a villain, and you've talked about his role in all of this. But we are talking predominantly here about what we would call blue cities,
right.
Cities that are, single party in many cases. Democratic mayors, Democratic city councils, states with Democratic governors, all targeting homelessness and treating it increasingly as a form of crime, rather than what one might hope to see.
Right. This is true. This is a bipartisan attack, yeah. In large part. It's not limited by political parties. So I think it's a failure to confront the issue of housing and to take on the need for public investment and for regulation of the private market. And it may be a reflection of the private interests behind housing that, local politicians or state officials don't want to take on the developers who are in the private equity companies that are promoting some of these trends. So, they want to do something. They are under pressure to do something about homelessness. No one likes to see people living on the street. No one likes encampments proliferating across the country as they are. And so there's enormous pressure to do something. And the thing that seems easy to do at the moment is pass a law outlawing this public presence, instead of taking on the true solution, which would involve an investment in housing, an investment of public resources, and a restraint on the private market that is now dominating housing and causing rents to skyrocket. So that is, from a political perspective, is a much harder thing to do.
I think it's worth noting that the dominant real estate interest in most American cities is the homeowner, not just private equity and not just the developers, but the people who are frightened that something will happen to their home values. But let me ask you, the policy part of this seems remarkably clear. Mm-hmm. It's a political problem that we're talking about.
Right.
So how does one change the politics around homelessness? How does one convince people
right.
to embrace these policies?
Well, so I think that it will take a coalition, a large coalition of people, and it takes seeing homelessness as not an isolated thing. homelessness is part of a much larger issue. It's the tip of a much larger problem. It's part of the crisis of affordable housing, which affects people, many more people. And so I think if people can see that, then there is a potentially much larger coalition that can get behind these kinds of solutions. So it's also part of growing inequality in this country that is affecting really everybody, or not everybody, obviously, but many people. So I think the way to do it is by making clear that homelessness is part of a larger problem. It's part of a larger problem of poverty, of housing, unaffordability, of inequality, and that many people have a stake in addressing it. And to frame it that way, to really mobilize people to put pressure on. And this is happening actually at the state and local level right now. There are examples of community groups getting together, mobilizing. In Seattle, recently, a group came together called House Our Neighbors and began advocating for a local level social housing developer to be created at the city level. And they were successful in creating this and building public support where there had been none. They started without public support behind their proposal, and through a process of public education and outreach and informing people, were able to build support to get this thing enacted. And then after that, to get it funded, which they did by separate ballot initiative, which just passed a few months ago with over almost 60% of the vote. So that is pretty remarkable, and it shows that given community organizing and given sufficient public engagement, it is possible to make change. And there are more campaigns like this in communities around the country. So I think even in this grim time, it's possible to make progress.
You write in the book that housing should be regarded as a human right, and that conceptualizing housing as a human right would be helpful in advancing this project. What does it mean to say that housing is a human right, and how does it help to believe that?
Well, so housing is a human right, and we tend to forget this, but after World War II, the world came together to develop something called the International Declaration of Human Rights. And this was a document that was crafted with U.S. leadership, and it set out human rights, basic human rights, and it has civil rights, political rights, but also has economic rights, including the right to housing. And so this is something that the United States endorsed, in fact, largely wrote, and has been endorsed by the world community. So the world has said housing is a human right. It's something everybody needs. All human beings need a stable, safe place to live. And we're going to say it's a human right, something everyone should have just by virtue of being human. So if we frame it that way, then, and then there's a whole body of law that takes this seriously, that says, what does this mean? It means you develop policies, you develop systems of government in your government that ensure that this can actually come to be. And so that would mean that you use your resources in such a way that no one's homeless. Everyone has a safe, decent, affordable place to live. And, we're very far from that right now in this country. But setting that as an ideal and also a guide of what our policies should be aiming for is very important. And it's, I think it's what we should aim for. And we used to. I mean, even so, in 1949, the federal government enacted the Housing Act that states as a goal a decent home for every American family. This is taking seriously housing as a human right. But it stated it as a goal, didn't make it a requirement. So that's, that's the gap between a goal and taking something seriously and enshrining it as a law. Finland has the right to housing in its constitution. I think it helps doesn't automatically mean that it's implemented, but it means this is what we as a country believe, we as a society believe. Everybody should have some basic things in life. And then we make that happen.
Mm-hmm. So after World War II, when the government sought to provide housing for a generation that didn't have nearly enough, some of that was accomplished in the way you've talked about through social housing programs. Some of it was accomplished by making it cheap and easy for private companies to build a lot of suburban tract housing. That's how Nassau County grew up.
Right.
And I'm curious, does that play any role in your vision of how we solve this problem? Making it possible for private developers to build more housing in American cities. And perhaps not just, like the forms of housing we no longer have, like SROs are not something the government has ever operated. It's a type of development that people ran for profit. Should we make that possible again?
Right. Well, I think private developers could do that, but private developers need to be subject to some level of control, some level of public control. Right now, that's missing. I mean, deregulation is part of the problem. I know that there's a line of thought that says the problem is too much regulation. I don't buy that. Private developers are building housing now. The problem is not a lack of housing. The problem is a lack of affordable housing. Private developers are building luxury housing. Some of that luxury housing is unoccupied. In cities around the world, there are vacant units in these luxury buildings, and that's happening here in New York, too. Billionaires Row. I mean, a lot of this property is vacant. It's not as if housing doesn't exist. The housing that's being built is not affordable to people. And so we have homelessness at the same time as we have these empty units. And so I think, it's not that private developers can't do this. It's just that private developers alone, motivated solely by profit, will not do it. And they haven't done it. They have to be accountable to building housing for people that need it and that's affordable. And yes, under those conditions, yes, they could. And there's no reason why they shouldn't.
We're going to turn to the audience in just a minute, so you all should be thinking about the questions that you have. But I want to ask you before we do about something I take to be a hopeful, although incomplete success, which is the efforts of a series of administrations to address one particular kind of homelessness, veterans who were homeless. What can we learn from the story of the federal government's efforts to help those people?
So there has been success with veteran homelessness, and that has come because there was a focus on them, and there was political support, and there was money. And, putting money into housing for veterans will help address veteran homelessness. So I think it proves the point that if you fund housing, that helps. I think that's what we can learn from that. It's not a mystery, really. It's that, and veterans have more support in Congress because they're veterans. And that's, it's sort of the opposite of demonizing people. It's saying, oh, these are veterans, we need to help our veterans.
I've seen an estimate that the cost of extending that program, those same services, to the entire population of Americans experiencing homelessness would be about the cost of an aircraft carrier.
Yeah.
That's the scale of what, just so people understand,
Right.
when we say money, how much money are we talking about?
Right.
We're talking about one aircraft carrier, roughly,
Right.
in order to do that.
Yeah. Well,
I want to ask you, a person who's been working on these issues for half a century now. It must require,
Not
I'm sorry
quite.
to put it that way. But
Not quite. I was very young when
this
I
is not a
started.
question about age, it's a question about optimism. I guess I'm just struck by the optimism that you have about this. You know, you've been working on this for a long time. You've made some significant progress, but we still have the fundamental problem. What gives you hope? What keeps you going?
Well, first of all, I think despair is not an option. I think optimism is important because without optimism, you don't have advocacy. You have to believe that a different world is possible in order to try to make it possible. And fundamentally, I believe that people are capable of empathy. I believe that people are capable of understanding that people are not homeless because they want to be, and that everybody is affected when housing is out of reach. So I guess I do have faith in fundamental goodness of human beings and their ability to understand. And I don't think that I have the luxury of pessimism. I think I view optimism as a moral imperative in a sense. I view it as essential to my own humanity to believe in the possibility of a better world and to work for that. And I don't, that's not to say I'm naive. I don't feel, right now I know we're at a very difficult moment. It's a frightening moment. And I think now more than ever, it's very important to hang on to that idea of something different and something better and work towards that. And, maybe that's optimism. It's something. It's a belief that something different is possible.
You tell a story in your book about your uncle. Perhaps you could share that with us?
Sure. So so my uncle Niarchos was my mother's younger brother. I never met him because he was executed at the age of 23 by the Nazis. He was living in Nazi-occupied Greece, and he resisted, like many Greeks did. And he was captured and jailed and executed. And he wrote letters from jail, which I found after my parents died. They had a hard time. My mother had a very hard time talking about him. So I never knew about these letters until after they died, but I found them. And the last one that he wrote was on the eve of his execution. He knew he was going to die in the morning, and he wrote a letter to sort of the world that he would no longer be part of, urging people to continue to fight the darkness, and that he was not going to die due to disease or natural disaster, but his fellow human beings were going to kill him. But that he felt and called upon those who would come after him to continue fighting. And if everybody continued fighting, the light would return. So that's, I think that's very powerful, and I take that to heart. And I think that, takes all of us coming together. Everybody who shares can share a common vision of a better world, to come together and not give up and continue to fight.
Thank you. We're going to open up the conversation now. There are people with microphones among you. So if you have a question, raise your hand and they'll find you.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for taking us through the book and talking about your own sort of work with all of this throughout your life. I think, I grew up in New York City, and I think something that I've seen, and you touched upon it a little bit, really more frequently than anything else, is the extent to which, like, block associations and tenant groups and, like, community boards often play a real influential role in opposing the building of shelters and affordable housing generally. And I guess that feels like a really difficult thing for me to grapple with, because you want to make any kind of work that addresses homelessness community-centered and, working with a community to build something that benefits folks that are struggling. And so I guess I'm wondering how you grapple with that and what that sort of looks like.
Well, that's a very good question. There is, what you're talking about is NIMBYism, right? Not in my backyard, and that's a very real phenomenon. And this is, an indication of the public education that needs to happen, that people need to, our communities need to understand who homeless people are. And also it's an indication perhaps that shelter is not really the way to go. Shelter is essential, but it's not really the solution. It's a temporary solution, and it needs to be understood as that. The only answer I know of is education, humanizing, making clear that the people who are benefiting from these efforts are people who are human and who are, and also pushing back against some of these myths. Usually the argument is that, this is going to bring in crime, property values will go down. There are studies that show that this is not the case. Property values do not go down. People who are homeless do not bring in crime along with them. So that's, public education to inform people and to counter these myths.
Ellen? I grew up when there was an advent of Mitchell-Lama houses and cooperative co-ops like Rochdale Village and Co-op City, and those were always meant to be, I think, bringing in a lower class and a middle class and giving them housing that could be affordable so they could grow and be stable. And that, I think, from what I read, is not being supported anymore, not being supported in government. Is that part of the uber capitalism that you're seeing and you're talking about in government? And I think that NYCHA housing is still there, but maybe not as prevalent as what could be or what should be if they want to make it more available as to people who are coming out of homelessness.
Yeah.
Is that what I'm hearing?
I think that's exactly right. The funding has been cut for this kind of housing, and it's been portrayed as being dangerous and bad and not a good thing. So, part of my argument is that's what we have to change. We have to change that perception and that reality, because it is a reality when you don't provide the funds to keep up housing, that it's going to deteriorate and it's going to become something undesirable. It's going to become something that no one wants, and either to live in or to have in their backyard or in their neighborhood.
Yes, my wife and I are presently living in what they call safe havens. It got to the point where victims of Hurricane Sandy, we've been in and out of shelters to the point where they have us living separately. You spoke about the drugs. My wife and I don't do drugs. We don't have no diseases. I'm recovering from a double bypass surgery, and yet we're still living in the shelter. What are we supposed to do?
So, was the question about being treated differently than people who were housed before the hurricane? Because that
You
is.
spoke about, the thing is, you mentioned affordable housing.
Yes.
People who get welfare, these lotteries want you to be making a minimum of $20,000 a year. People who get welfare, they're not making $5,000 a year.
Right.
We get SSI, which ain't even $12,000 a year. How do we afford these apartments?
Right. Well, that's exactly the problem that I'm talking about. That, I mean, first of all, housing by lottery is very problematic in itself, but also how you afford these apartments. I mean, the whole point of the idea of affordable housing as it's currently used is a very slippery concept. I mean, affordable housing is a poorly defined term. It can mean housing for people who make a lot more money than people who are extremely poor or who are homeless. So, that's actually one of we didn't have a chance to talk about this, but there's inclusionary zoning policies, for example, that give density bonuses to developers who develop a certain number of units of affordable housing. But sometimes what that affordable housing means is housing affordable to people who are making, $80,000 a year or over $100,000 a year. It's not housing that's affordable to people who are extremely poor. So I think that's a very good point, that people who are, on various welfare benefits or SSI, I mean, SSI, you can't really afford anything at this point. So, yeah, there's a very broad range when we're talking about affordable housing.
Hi, thank you for this discussion. I really appreciate it. So I think part of the problem is the shelter system itself. It's creating a disaster for people that I actually met firsthand, who were not supposed to be locked in the system, because once you enter into the homeless shelter, it's very hard to leave and transition into stable housing. And the way it's set up with DHS itself is that they charge people to be, housed an extraordinary dollar amount per day, like $400, right? So it's not a fair system itself, the shelter system. So, and I also know folks who actually had jobs and their lives spiraled and they no longer make money, so they just found themselves out in the streets. They're not supposed to be in such undignified ways to live in a shelter. They need better shelter system than that, at least. If the shelter system had done enough to account for all these loopholes that they're experiencing and not enough support when you're in the shelter system, you get addicts who you're abusing drugs in the shelter system, and other people living there get addicted to it easily. So that, in my view, has to be broken for this to be working effectively.
I'll just remind everyone that questions end with question marks.
We have time for one more. I'm gonna let it. One more on this side. And then Maria, you'll join us outside afterwards. The book is outside, so you can ask some questions there. Great, last question.
Oh, very good. Okay, so I'm a community organizer. I live in the area that Jacob Reese did all the photography for, so I have a mere amount of different subsidized housing, public housing, Michelamas, non-equity co-ops, and subsidized artists communities. So I want to bring a different perspective because we are talking about poverty. There was a recent study that said New Yorkers have to make $130,000 to be able to afford living here. And the fact that we're not talking about the people who we have created a situation where developers are developing for people who have money, and we don't talk about when the buildings get built, the people who are living there are getting subsidized. I have a building, a luxury development, it's a condo, and they're paying $30 a quarter. That's totally unfair. They're being subsidized to live in an area where most of the people can't afford to live there because it artificially inflates the property value. And the fact that we also are not talking about, you're saying poor people, lots of people are unable to live in New York now. And we also have development infrastructure for that. Bed surfing, people are living in, people are renting out their laundromats. There's a whole ecosystem that has developed because people are working and they can no longer afford to live here. And the mayor who started this whole thing with the AMI.
Ma'am, do you have a question for me?
Yes, why are we still funding developers and not community organizations? Because it's clearly a failure.
Right. Well, because developers have money, and money is increasingly important in politics, and that's what we're up against. I really think that that's true, that, you know, the voices of people who are you know, community organizers like yourself have to match the money of developers and get the attention of politicians. So it takes a tremendous amount of community organizing, and good for you for doing that. It takes a lot of work like that to really counter the influence of these developers on political leaders.
Okay, that's it.
That's all the time we have. All right. Thank you very much for coming tonight. I hope you all pick up a copy of the book.